Well, let's go ahead and we'll get started. Today our lesson's called The Ice Age for everybody that's tuning in on live stream. What we did learn about the ark. Anybody remember what we learned about the ark in its dimensions? Anybody got a different dimension? 300 by 50 by 30. 300 is its what? Length. What's its width? 50. What's its height? 30. Good. All right. And does anybody remember the distances that would calculate out if we were to do it by feet? I gave those numbers last time. Anybody kind of remember? I gave you an idea of how what you would know.
571 feet long.
Close to that. It's 510 feet long. Okay. Next, anybody remember wide? Going from the corner of the church all the way across the street in about 15 feet, how wide would that be? It's more than 50. It's 85 feet. And then to multiply the height of our church twice, what you guess would that be? It's about 50 feet. It's 51 feet. At the pinnacle there, it's about 50. It's about 25 feet or so of the height of that. So that's what we talked about. Now you say, how do we get to the Ice Age? One of the things that we're going to look at today's lesson is going to be quite a bit different because of the fact that you don't find a lot of things said in the Bible about the Ice Age. In fact, you find very little, but the Bible does testify to the fact that it changed the world with the flood. And that's what we're really going to focus on, is that the flood itself would actually create an ice age. And we're going to look at that and see that here in just a moment. Today's going to be kind of like a science class. You're going to get an opportunity to see a lot of science ideas and stuff that go on here. So we're going to look at some terms that need to be defined that you'll hear used in some of the videos I'm going to show you here today. And then we're going to talk about some scripture here. So let me actually go to the scriptures first. If you go to Genesis chapter number 8, we see something that God makes a promise after the flood about the environment and the set of how things are going to run after that. Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. You can look in your Bible, or I think Richard's even put it up on the screen there for you as well. Verse number 20 through 22. Anybody got good eyes, want to read it out loud? Okay, go ahead, Paul.
And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean of it, and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar.
Okay.
And the Lord smelled of sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake, for the
Imagination.
of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite anymore in every living thing as I have done.
Last verse.
While the earth remains
Seed time.
and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease.
Okay. So, why was Noah offering this sacrifice to the Lord? Anybody remember what happened there? Why was Noah offering the sacrifice to the Lord? Yeah, it was sort of a way of thanking God for preserving him. He was remembering the fact that he had been saved from the wrath of God through the flood. By the way, do we do that as believers today? Have sacrifices of thanksgiving that we offer to God out of the fact that we know he saved us? Do we do that in any way? Our service to God is looked upon as a sacrifice of thanksgiving. The Bible calls the thanksgiving that comes from our lips, called it a sacrifice as well. So that's what Noah was doing. He was thanking God for the fact that he had saved him from the wrath that had fallen upon the whole world. How did God view Noah's sacrifice according to those scriptures that we looked at?
He accepted it.
Yeah, he accepted it. What did he say specifically? Something about the sacrifice. Has something to do, sounds like candy almost. Or what you would smell when you're smelling a cooking grill. A sweet savor. He said he smelled a sweet savor in it. It means, it's sort of a way of saying, like what Paul just said, he accepted it. It was good to him. Does God think that about every sacrifice? No. Now, there's some sacrifices we know he's rejected, said it's an abomination to him. Don't even want to be around it because of the intent of the heart that they had when they brought it to God, or the motive behind the heart. All right. What do we learn about man's condition there in that passage? So the flood didn't solve the problem, did it? The flood didn't fix the problem. That's what God said in Genesis 6 about man before the flood, that his heart was always evil continually, and now we're coming back to this point, and he's saying it's still that way. Man hasn't yet been fixed of that problem. Now, what did God promise in verse 21? In verse 21.
God again cursed the ground any man for man's sake.
Yeah, he would never... Okay, that takes us back to something way back in the garden, right? That's where the very first curse came, and that's what he's referring to. He would not add a curse to that curse, right? Remember Adam and Eve? When he said, cursed is the ground for your sake, he said that to Adam. He's saying, I'm not going to curse it anymore. It's sort of like saying, God, if you think what you got now is bad, if God had cursed it more, you'd have it more. It would be worse than what you think it is now. So that's obviously something there, it could be said. And then what else does he say? Bill said it there. He's not going to do what else? Something to do with the flood. He's never going to flood the earth again and destroy all flesh. So two promises made there in that scripture passage there. Now, if anybody remembers, how did he confirm the promise?
Rainbow.
Yes, with the rainbow. He confirmed the promise, and then he described what that promise is going to look like, that it will never flood again, and the earth is going to remain the way it's going to be. Look in verse 22. How did he describe it?
Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night.
Okay, so what are those? What are those that we know about? Seasons and days, right? Seed time. What's seed time, Bill?
Seed time.
What would seed time be, Bill? You practice it every when you're putting corn in the ground, right? That's seed time.
I was thinking SEA.
Yeah, seed time. Okay, so we're talking about time when your springtime. He says that's going to remain while the earth remains. Okay, harvest. What would harvest be? That'd be fall for the most part. Now, are there some places that they harvest in the summer and harvest in the winter? Yeah, so it just depends on what parts of the world you live in. But those cycles are going to continue to go on throughout the world. What else does he talk about? Cold and heat. What would we call those? Winter and summer. Okay, so we know that those are going to continue to go on. And then what else is going to happen?
Summer and winter.
Well, day and night. We know those cycles are going to remain. So here's the point. This is important to remember. This is a promise God is making. I'm never going to flood the earth, and I'm not going to curse it any more than it already is cursed while the earth remains. He makes actually to describe what that's going to look like. He says the cycles that we experience regularly are not going to stop. Now, when you hear someone saying, and they were saying it quite a while for the last few years, you've heard it, they've changed the name of it, global warming, that the earth is getting so hot we're going to end up losing whatever cycles of things going on. Does that violate the promise here God made? Yeah, it does. It's because it's saying that it's going to get so hot and the world's going to end up dying. Actually, did you know heat is actually good for the world? Did you know that? Cold is actually what kills things. Heat, most oftentimes, is what allows things to be produced longer. If you have a longer heating season, guess what you got? A longer growing season. Yeah. So it's actually a better thing, not a worse thing. Now, obviously, heat can be overbearing and cause drought, and other kinds of things as well. But again, he's saying the cycles are going to continue to go. They're not going to have one thing getting so bad and another one going away or whatever, okay? So, yes.
This morning on the news, the weatherman was telling us that we're going to have cold temperatures setting records this weekend and this week. But that does not mean the world is not still warming up.
Oh, he said that in the same breath, huh? Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, so you kind of get that idea of the fact that he's making the promise that things aren't going to change. Now, does that mean necessarily that you're not going to have times where things are colder or things are hotter for a time? Yeah, and what our lesson's going to be about today is that there was a time where things were colder, and there's plenty of evidence for it. There's still evidence today. You can go and see some of the evidence. You can still see some of the remainders of this stuff that hasn't yet fully melted away. We're going to talk about what this was about, why this is, and you say you don't see it very much in the Bible, but the Bible gives you clues to why it even existed, why it ever happened, okay? And so I've got 5 videos that we're going to work through and go through. This is going to be like a science class sort of today, but I want to give you 3 definitions before we get into those videos. One of them, Richard, if you'll put it up there, one of them is uniformity. Uniformity is this, and this really picks it up out of what we talked about. It's God's creation follows laws that allow us to perform scientific inquiry. What does that mean? It means that God is consistent. We get out of that, God's faithful. He established the world to work the way it works, right? If we think about today, our ability, we knew today was going to happen, didn't we? I mean, no one was going to bed last night thinking this might be the last day we had. We expect that the sun's going to still come up tomorrow, right? And we expect that it's going to get warmer this year. Why do we expect that? Because that's how God has established things. We expect there to be a consistent. We expect gravity to still be working the way it works. Aren't you glad it doesn't change from day to day? We expect time to still sort of be working the same, right? I mean, there's all sorts of laws and rules that we take for granted every day and expect them to work because they've always have. And that's because God set them in the creation. That's what uniformity means, that there is this consistency that we can expect God is going to do what He's going to do. He works according to the laws. Now, there is another term here, a second term, Richard, if you'll put that one up there. It's called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism, and this is a term that means that as we see the processes going on today, they have always been. They have always been. Now, some of you might agree with that. How many people would agree with that? Raise your hand. You think I'm going to give you a trick question? I am. Have they always been this way?
I would say no.
Was there a big event that has changed the way things are working? The worldwide flood affected a lot of things. Mount St. Helens affected a lot of things in its environment. Do things have a tendency to change the way things are going? If big events in history have a way of changing the way things are going, the direction things are going. Doesn't necessarily mean it undoes all the laws, but it's going to change a bunch of things. The flood literally changed the world. And it affected why we're going to talk about the Ice Age. So we need to think about that. When we think about uniformitarianism, you say, why is that an important word? Because people want to use that word to talk about the layers of rock. Why you have all these layers of rock? Because they've been just slowly building up over long periods of time. But if you had a worldwide flood, that would answer why you got big layers of rock. Because it dropped big sediments on top of each other, and then it dried and it became rock. Okay, that explains a different. But if you're going to look and say the world has always been the way it's always been, you would have to come to that conclusion that these things happened over long periods of time. That's where the millions of years idea comes from, or billions of years now. Then there's another one that you need to know. This is called, the third definition, it's called catastrophism. This is what Bill was hinting at a little bit by some of the things he said. Catastrophism, which is the idea that God actually interposes Himself once in a while and destroys stuff. So here in this case, that the flood was a unique global event that greatly impacted the earth. God every once in a while steps in and judges things, and it affects the way in which things are running. Okay? So that understood, when we talk about the Ice Age here that we're going to look at here this morning, we need to understand it from that perspective. How did the Ice Age even happen? Why is it even important for us to know? Because people that are evolutionists will say there have been 50 ice ages over, and there's hundreds of thousands of years in between one and another, and they're marking all that off. But that doesn't even fit a biblical timeline at all. But we do have evidence that an ice age happened. So we need to be able to answer, where did that come from? Why all of a sudden did things get cold? What would have caused that? So is this going to matter in eternity? No. Is it going to deal with your salvation? No. But here's what it does. It gives you answers to somebody who might be a skeptic who wants to use something like this for a reason to doubt the Bible. Okay? And the Bible's got the answer, as we're going to see here. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you the first set of videos. If TJ, if you'll get some of our lights. We're going to leave the lights up here for the camera angle, at least the lights for that, or for the camera light that it needs. So, but you should be able to see still pretty good on the screen. What we're going to do here this morning is look at 5 different videos. The first one is done by Ken Ham, and then we're going to have another one that's done by a kid. He is a kid, but obviously he was instructed by an adult. Noah Justice. Third one is we're going to see a couple videos by Michael Ord, who is a meteorologist, also climatist. And then the last one is just a documentary video, a little clip of a documentary video. We're going to talk about some different things that you'll see out of those. All right, so first one, let's go ahead with Ken Ham, The Ice Age. The title of it is Fact or Fiction.
You know, people often ask me about the Ice Age. Do you believe in an Ice Age? Actually, we believe in one Ice Age, but generated by the flood. The flood is the key to understanding the Ice Age. You can't just have an Earth getting colder and colder. Everything would freeze over. Actually, you need something to produce warm water and evaporation, and then to enable precipitation to build up the ice for an Ice Age. It's the flood that explains it. Watch this short video, and you'll understand what happened.
The ice on Greenland and Antarctica is in places miles deep and hundreds of miles wide. In the present, however, all but the edges of these ice sheets are cold deserts. Not enough snow and ice falls there to build up the depth of ice that we find today, even if long periods of time were available. The flood of the Bible may provide an answer. First of all, flood rocks contain thick piles of lava and huge volumes of volcanic ash. Meteorologist Mike Ord has suggested that this might have led to the Ice Age.
There was a lot of warm water added to the pre-flood oceans from the crust, and also a lot of lava flows and volcanism that heat the waters.
Evidence in fossils suggests that the oceans were warmed up in the course of the flood.
The average temperature of the ocean is 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, after the flood, it could have been an average of about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And you could have taken a swim in the Arctic Ocean right after the flood. It was so warm. But then it's going to start cooling down, and that cooling is mainly by evaporation. So the key here is that for that warm water, you evaporate so much more water vapor in the air.
As the oceans cooled after the flood, heavy snow began to fall. Computer simulations that begin with warm oceans show snow falling far inland over cool continents. Ice sheets build up thousands of feet thick, where we see evidence for such ice today. This ice built up in only a few centuries of time. The whole process was sped up by volcanic ash cooling the earth after the flood.
Because of the instability of the earth after the flood, there'd be a lot of volcanism. Aerosols are tiny particles about a micron in diameter, and they'll float up there in the stratosphere for several years, and they reflect sunlight back to space. So you have a cooling mechanism. The ice is going to build up, and then finally it's going to come to a point where it's going to peak. That's glacial maximum.
Once the oceans cooled enough, the evaporation slowed, the snows stopped, and the ice began to melt. Calculations suggest that the buildup, movement, and melting of ice did not require many thousands of years as is traditionally taught. From a warm world at the end of the flood to the melting of the ice took only centuries of time.
And then I see evidence of the one ice age and the short, rapid ice age that melts catastrophically. This is what I see based on science.
Present climate is not the key to understanding what produced thick piles of ice in Greenland and Antarctica. It looks like the Bible had the key all along. The Great Flood in the days of Noah.
See, if you don't believe in the flood, you don't understand the flood, you won't understand the ice age. And there's another aspect to that as well. The Bible says there's never going to be another global flood, which means we'll never have an ice age as we've had in the past. You know, isn't it incredible? The more that you study this, and you start to realize, wow, the Bible's history about creation, about the flood, and so this explains the world. It does. It does, and science confirms it over and over again. Isn't it exciting?
Understand that when we talk about if you remember the flood, what did it talk about happened in the flood? The fountains of the deep shut up. If you're thinking about that happening, you're talking about hot water shooting up, you're talking about volcanoes erupting, you're talking about the earth breaking open in part, and there being all sorts of ash. That would add to this issue. So you'd have hot seas or warm seas that would cause a lot of evaporation, and then you'd have a lot of the aerosols that keep the sun from being able to melt things away when it starts to get cold. All right, so that's one part. Okay, what we're going to look at next is this is about a 12, almost a 13-minute video. This is a kid named Noah Justice, and he's actually going and looking at Glacier National Park up in Montana, and is talking about some of the things. And even though he's a kid, you're going to find out he says he's obviously had an adult to give him some instruction on some of the things he's saying. So, but I'm sure you'll get a lot out of what he says. Okay, go ahead, Richard, you play that one for us.
One of America's most incredible national parks sits on the border of Montana and Canada. It's called Glacier National Park. Giant cliffs of sedimentary rock rise thousands of feet high.
How did the rocks form? And what processes carved these giant valleys?
Secular scientists say these rocks are over 1.6 billion years old and contain stromatolites, built by microbes supposed to have formed over 1 billion years ago, according to evolution. They also say many ice ages over millions of years carved these valleys.
Yet, there are over 60 ideas about how the Ice Age formed and melted, showing secular scientists really don't have any one theory that works well with the evidence.
Some people doubt there was an ice age, but the evidence is all around us.
What this national park is really known for is how the Ice Age left its mark in these valleys.
Evidence for the Ice Age was discovered in the mid-1800s. What scientists observed were large U-shaped valleys and moraines. U-shaped valleys are formed when an ice sheet moves down a valley, eroding the valley walls and valley bottom. We can still observe this happening today in glaciated areas of the world. Moraines are caused by a moving glacier. As the ice moves down a valley, the weight of the glacier pushes rocks and debris to the side or out in front of it. This material is called lateral moraines and terminal or end moraines. Some people doubt there was an ice age, but the evidence is all around us. When secular scientists first discovered evidence for an ice age, it didn't fit their uniformitarian view, because uniformitarianism says that the processes we see today are the ones that happened in the past. And we don't see ice ages forming today, do we? These scientists observed evidence for at least one ice age, but had no idea how quickly it formed or melted.
Because they believe in long ages, they guessed an ice age would last 100,000 years, and just one ice age didn't seem reasonable. They then discovered supposed evidence in the moraines and ocean sediments for many ice ages spanning over 2 million years.
They claim that we have seen at least 4 major ice ages, and some scientists even suggest our distant past included ice everywhere, calling it Snowball Earth. Secular scientists say that the last ice age occurred around 10,000 years ago, but what does the evidence really show?
They also say that we're due for another ice age soon, but they really don't have a clue about how it develops in the first place.
So, what elements do you need for an ice age?
The primary elements you need are abundant moisture, mild winters, and cool summers. Let's take a look at each one of these.
Abundant moisture usually comes from our oceans, especially warm oceans. Most of our large storms and hurricanes come from the equatorial regions, where the water is extremely warm. But to develop the vast amounts of moisture to create an ice age would require much warmer oceans worldwide.
Next, you need mild winters. If winters are too cold, the air cannot hold moisture, and therefore it can't snow. We see this in the Arctic, where temperatures get into the sub-zero level and snowfall is absent. When we say mild winters, we're not saying winters above freezing, just winters about 20 or 30 degrees below freezing.
Finally, you need cool summers. How do you get that? The answer might surprise you. Mechanisms such as volcanoes can put ash and aerosols into the atmosphere and cause global cooling for short periods of time. This cooling usually lasts just a couple of years from one major event. For instance, Mount Pinatubo's massive eruption in 1991 caused the Earth's average temperature to drop by a degree or two for many months.
If several large eruptions happened simultaneously around the Earth, the effect would be much greater.
But to create consistently cool summers worldwide, you would need large volcanic activity for several decades. There is evidence to support this idea because we find signs of global volcanic activity in the Earth's recent past. This evidence includes many extinct supervolcanoes, huge ash beds, and gigantic lava flows found throughout the world.
Secular scientists guess this volcanic activity happened a long time ago, possibly millions of years, because historical records do not record worldwide supervolcanic activity.
Yet, a good indication of a recent explosive past is Yellowstone's supervolcano. Geysers, mud pods, and steam pour out of this location today. There is even talk of a huge eruption happening in the near future.
If supervolcanoes died out millions of years ago, then the Yellowstone caldera should be extinct, but it's not.
We continue to see volcanoes erupt today, but not at the same level as in the past. Big eruptions today only cause minor global cooling.
When all three of these conditions happen together, abundant moisture, mild winters, and cool summers, you could have a rapidly building ice age.
In the uniformitarian model, it would be very difficult to generate these conditions at the same time for just one ice age, not to mention many others. Every computer model they have run doesn't work. It puts ice in the wrong places, cools down the wrong places, or doesn't produce the right amount of ice. This is a major problem.
In addition, the few evidences they use to prove multiple ice ages could be interpreted as due to other geologic processes.
For instance, they use evidence in moraines to claim that one ice age pushed materials along, then the ice melted. Another ice age developed and pushed the moraine around a bit more. This supposedly happened many times with one moraine. But we can observe today how glaciers advance and recede, producing similar features to what secular scientists say is evidence of many ice ages. Yet it was only one glacier that caused it. As far as the chemical variations in seafloor sediments go, the evidence is very imprecise when trying to prove they are from multiple ice ages. Other geologic factors could have been at work.
Since no one was there to observe and record these events happening, their ideas are just presumptions.
This sketchy guesswork is why they have over 60 models for an ice age, because none of them fully explain how even one ice age could have occurred using current observable conditions.
But there is one event in the past that could easily have created the right conditions for one major ice age, the global flood of Noah's day. As Bible-believing creationists, we have a good answer for how the ice age formed.
During the global flood, the Earth was going through catastrophic global changes. At the beginning of the flood, the Bible says the fountains of the great deep burst forth. This included warm subterranean water from within the Earth's crust, which was ejected onto the surface. In addition, the fountains of the great deep included molten lava.
Although the Bible does not speak of them specifically, some creation scientists have found evidence that the flood could have involved meteorites entering the Earth's atmosphere. These events would have added heat to the Earth's waters.
Finally, large-scale catastrophic tectonic activity would have caused friction. The water on top of the tectonic plates would have heated up dramatically as the plates were subducted rapidly.
All of these processes would have warmed the floodwaters to a very high temperature by the end of the flood.
Seafloor sediments indicate the waters were much warmer in the past around the entire Earth. Estimates for ocean temperatures worldwide could have risen to at least 90 degrees Fahrenheit or even higher.
These warm waters would have existed worldwide for hundreds of years after the flood.
These conditions would have caused tremendous evaporation, resulting in very large precipitation near the shores and snowstorms in the higher latitudes. We can look to the Gulf of Mexico every summer to see how warm waters grow large hurricanes. As storms move out of Africa and into the Atlantic, they increase in power. As they hit the Gulf, these storms can build up very quickly into large hurricanes because of the near 90 degrees surface water temperatures.
In the same way, worldwide warmth of the oceans right after the flood would have caused massive storms across entire continents.
Most of the mountain chains we see today show evidence of them rising quickly during and after the flood. The massive storms moving across these mountains would have dumped large amounts of snow in these regions, and the snowpacks would have eventually turned into ice sheets. In current weather patterns, we see how the Gulf of Mexico produces storms during the winter months, which move north into the Midwest, creating large snowstorms. Of course, the snow does not stick around because we have hot and humid summers.
But with mild winters and cool summers after the flood, the snow would have accumulated quickly in the mountains and not melted off.
This snow and ice would have eventually filled the valleys and created large ice sheets over the northern and southern continents. Some estimates from creation scientists are that huge ice sheets could have accumulated in 200 to 300 years, starting within decades after the flood.
But some say it takes tens of thousands of years to build up ice sheets that thick. Think again.
During World War II, a squadron of 6 P-38s and 2 B-17 bombers had to crash land on top of Greenland's ice sheets. None of the crew was lost, and they were all rescued and returned safely home after spending several days on the desolate ice. In the 1980s, a team of ambitious historians decided to go back and find these planes and bring them home. They assumed the job would be fairly easy because they made the assumption that ice does not accumulate quickly. They were wrong.
This assumption was made because secular scientists tell us it takes thousands or even millions of years to develop an ice sheet.
When an ice core is examined from Greenland or Antarctica, it is thought that each distinct layer of ice is 1 year of accumulation. But different processes may have been at work. Creation scientists have suggested that each layer is an individual storm, not a year's worth of accumulation.
After several failed attempts at finding the planes near the surface, they eventually located them much further down. In fact, they were buried under 250 feet of ice.
They eventually brought back one complete P-38, and it now flies at air shows throughout the country.
This is just one example showing that it doesn't take long ages to build up an ice pack, just the right conditions. With the meteorological conditions right after the flood, building the ice age quickly was not a problem.
Okay. Huh? Yeah, he waves his arms pretty good, doesn't he? Okay. Yeah, he's entertaining just to watch him wave his hands there. Okay, well, the next one that we're going to look at, so here he's making the point that how many ice ages would be there biblically? Just one. You don't need multiple ice ages to account for what happened. You just need the right conditions. And the flood would produce those right conditions. All right, the next couple are actually, you're going to like this one, I think. The question always comes up, one of the big things you hear about the ice age when you hear about it, you hear about woolly mammoths and animals moving across that are unique animals, and they're finding these woolly mammoths frozen in the tundra, even standing up. They're going to argue that even the conditions of the ice age would have produced this, and it's quite an interesting thing. We're going to see that. So again, we're going to watch about another 12.5-minute video here, Where Are the Mammoths Now, by Michael Ord, and I think you'll enjoy it. He's a little duller in nature. He's not as wave your arms type of guy like the other one was, but I think you'll enjoy what he explains on this. So, all right, Richard.
Well, the post-flood rapid ice age can also explain the extinctions at the end of the ice age. But first we must talk about their multiplication early in the ice age, right after the flood. The environment with cool summers and mild winters and heavy precipitation would be ideal for large mammals to just really thrive and spread out all over the world. These animals were not used to cold, and they weren't used to drought. They were used to a different environment than what the uniformitarian ice ages indicate, which are cold and generally dry, especially towards the end of their ice ages. So they would thrive. They'd spread all over Siberia, down into the United States, Central America and South America. It was a dynamic ice sheet. It wasn't steady state for very long. These mild winters and cool summers were changing as time went on. As the oceans were cooling, you're getting less precipitation towards a late ice age. You're getting colder temperatures in wintertime, but summers were warming up and the ice was starting to melt because of the warmer summers. So you melt the ice by the warmer summers, and if the winters are cold enough, you don't get that much precipitation, so you don't add much during the winter, so you just have a net melting. And the animals weren't used to colder winters, so they were stressed. So the uniformitarian ideas fall far, far short. One of the most significant mysteries is the extinction of the woolly mammoths in Siberia, Alaska, and the Northwest Yukon Territory. First of all, how many were there? If it was just a few, that wouldn't be any big deal, but according to the experts that study the mammals of the ice age in that region, there are millions of them still buried in the permafrost. The bones and tusks of the woolly mammoth are so well preserved, you can use the ivory of the tusks still today. Why are they well preserved? If they sat around in the elements, within a matter of 24 years, they would have disintegrated. So why are they so well preserved? And again, why are they in the permafrost? Permafrost is rock hard. How would you get them down in the permafrost? How can us creationists explain these woolly mammoths? Obviously they lived after the flood because they're in the permafrost. They're associated with the ice age because you find their bones on top of glacial debris in northwest Siberia. So they actually lived during and at the very end of the ice age, and we're following generally the ice ages as ice sheets were melting in northwest Siberia northward. They were kind of following up on them, and then a lot of them died right on top of the glacial debris. So they're from the post-flood ice age period. So how does the ice age account for them? Well, here's how I think it happened in the unique post-flood ice age.
The climate of the post-flood ice age had mild winters and cool summers at the beginning. And because the Arctic Ocean was warm, you probably could take a swim in the Arctic Ocean right after the flood. And because of all this warm ocean and warm onshore flow and evaporation, Siberia and Alaska would have mild winters with heavy precipitation, and so it was probably forested early in the Ice Age. But as the Ice Age grew and the Arctic Ocean surface cooled off more and more, it would cool off and it become drier. In the early part of the Ice Age and in the middle part of the Ice Age, it became a grassland. It would be an ideal environment for woolly mammoths and many other animals that just slowly move up there by the millions and live there. Because it wasn't so cold in the winter, it wouldn't challenge them because of the coldness. And there was no permafrost, so there weren't any summer bogs. Because at the end of the flood, it was newly laid sediments and they would have been from warm water, so there wasn't any permafrost practically by definition right after the flood. And it would hold off for quite a while. Permafrost is caused by freezing temperatures from the air and they cool the ground from the surface down. Permanently frozen soil, it doesn't thaw out except for the top in the summer. There's a lot of evidence that there was no permafrost in those regions. One of the animals that lived in Siberia, as well as northern Alaska and the northern Yukon Territory, was the saga antelope. And the saga antelope has real small hooves, and they can't negotiate permafrost. They like wide open spaces of solid ground, which indicates that there's no permafrost. Other indications of no permafrost is that you had a lot of burrowing mammals. How can an animal burrow in permafrost? Two burrowing animals was the badger and the ferret. You also had beavers there, which I'm sure it'd be very hard to live in an area like that with permafrost. So there is plenty of evidence there's no permafrost, which is totally against the uniformitarian idea where they believe permafrost has been there for millions of years. The post-flood rapid ice age provides an ideal environment for why they would be up in Siberia. Also, there's plenty to eat because it was a grassland. In fact, it's been determined in areas non-glaciated in the mid-latitudes and the high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere is one huge grassland all around the Northern Hemisphere. And it's been called by Dale Guthrie of the University of Alaska in Fairbanks the Mammoth Steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E. That's a term for a grassland essentially, like the high plains of today, that has a wet spring and a dry summer and late fall. So you get a lot of grass that grows and dries out. And that's kind of the environment they think of up in Siberia, which is totally different than that area now. The Ice Age was dynamic. It was always changing. Talk about your climate change. You had climate changes on fast. In the late Ice Age, the oceans were cooling off. And then you were having less evaporation and more sea ice was developing and the glaciers were starting to melt and spreading fresh water over the salt water, causing sea ice to form a lot faster. And once you get sea ice, you cap the oceans from evaporating, so you cause more drying. And with the cold ice sheets in place still, even though they're melting, and the low latitudes warming, you have strong north-south temperature differences. And that's what drives the winds aloft. So you'd have a lot stronger winds than you do today and a lot drier conditions. So the climate at the end of the Ice Age would be characterized by dry, strong storms. And these storms would whip up a lot of dust, of which we find lots of evidence of this all over the world in the form of a windblown silt called lust. It's just south of the ice sheet in the United States and in Europe, and lots of it over Siberia and Alaska. These strong winds could explain this windblown dust. It's this combination that caused the animals at the end of the Ice Age to go extinct, as well as the woolly mammoth and the Columbian mammoths at the end of the Ice Age. To specifically find out how they died, I went to the experts who've been studying them and found out what sediments that they're buried in. And the experts say that they're mostly buried in this windblown silt. So this brings up a lot of options to explain the other mysteries associated with the woolly mammoth. For instance, the windblown silt during these dry, strong, windy storms could cover up a dead animal pretty fast and preserve it. That's why they're well preserved, because they were buried pretty fast in windblown silt. But then what about the other mysteries, like the standing position in some of the carcasses and skeletons, and the suffocation, the broken bones? Well, the dust can explain that. Also, they can explain how they got in the permafrost. Okay, here's how this can work. As the windblown silt covers them up, the permafrost is forming, especially late in the Ice Age, and it's forming and getting deeper and deeper in the ground. The dust that forms on these animals, the permafrost comes up from the ground, and also the cooling comes down from the top, so the windblown silt freezes pretty fast to help preserve them to this day. The standing position, the suffocation, the broken bones can be caused by huge dust storms. You'd expect monstrous dust storms once in a while. And to understand this, I went to information on the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s in the Midwest, where you had huge dust storms. Some of these dust storms in the Midwest covered up fences, machinery, and sometimes covered up barns or houses clear to the roof. This is how I believe you can explain the condition of some of the carcasses. They were out eating what they could, and suddenly the wind picked up. They turned their back to the wind. Then that strong, dry cold front comes through, and the wind whips up, and the visibility goes to zero, and the silt starts packing up around them. They act like a snow fence in a blizzard, and dust will pack like snow hard, and once you get stuck in it, you can hardly move. And so as it piles up around them, he breathes this dust, and they suffocate, and they end up not being able to move or fall down, and they end up in a general standing position. And trying to extricate themselves out of the dust that's packing around them, they can easily twist their leg bones and break them by shearing or torsion force. Now, we have evidence that this could easily happen, because at Hot Springs, South Dakota, we have an ancient sinkhole, or an Ice Age sinkhole, where we have about 100 mammoths, some of them woolly mammoths, most of them Columbian mammoths. And the sinkhole filled up with windblown silt and is now a kind of a mound. Some of those mammoths have broken limb bones. And Larry Eggenbrod, the chief United States expert on woolly mammoths, says that about the only way that can happen is by twisting, trying to extricate themselves out of mud. Well, the same thing would happen with woolly mammoths trying to get out of solid, packed, windblown silt all around it. So you can explain the broken limb bones that way. But what about the broken pelvis and ribs? Here's how I believe this happens. Once the woolly mammoth was totally interred within the windblown silt, covered up, and the permafrost has come up to meet the woolly mammoth and frozen from the top, he ends up in the permafrost. But permafrost is known to fault and shift. It can shift up to 50 feet sometimes. And this is how they can break the ribs and bones. After they're already in there, the permafrost can shift and break the pelvis and rib bones while they're in the permafrost. So the late post-flood rapid ice age can explain the mysteries of the woolly mammoths.
Okay, so how many people have ever heard that explanation before? Of why you see, how many people even knew that about woolly mammoths, that they're found standing up like that? Some of them. But that makes a little bit of sense. We can go right over to Bill's farm and look at wind-blown silt. It's all over his farm. It's all up and down, yeah. It's all up and down the whole state of Iowa. This whole Loess Hills, same stuff that they're talking about there. And where do you think that probably came from? Maybe during the same time that this was going on here as well in other parts of the world. All right, well, we got one more. This is a short video. Actually, we got two more, but these are talking about how animals spread over the world during the time of the Ice Age. One I think you're going to think is really interesting. Thought you probably never have thought about, because you probably didn't even know it was in existence. But that'll be the second video we're going to look at here. But this one is how animals spread around the world. It's by the same guy, Michael Ord. It's a little over 3 minutes long. Then the other one's just going to be just a generic video that I think the Creation Museum itself puts on. So Richard, if you'll go ahead and do those, just do those back to back for us.
Well, the post-flood rapid ice age, with its mild winters and cool summers, can also explain the spread out of the animals and man across the globe. For instance, with the lowlands of Siberia and Alaska not glaciated, but mild during the winter, maybe probably up to 50 degrees warmer, a lot of animals that can't tolerate much cold could easily spread up into northeast Siberia, and they can cross into Alaska because between Alaska and Siberia, there was a shallow strait, the Bering Strait, and that was either exposed early in the Ice Age because of tectonics, but we know at least it was exposed later in the Ice Age as sea level dropped because of ice piling up on land. In fact, the whole Bering Shelf and the Arctic Ocean were exposed for hundreds of miles. We find fossils on the shelves, and even on some islands hundreds of miles off the coast. So we know the sea level drop exposed the shelves. But these animals can spread from Siberia to Alaska. And then how would they get down to the United States, Central America, and South America? Well, because during the Ice Age we had another phenomenon occur, especially early in the Ice Age when we had mild winters. Along the east slopes of the Rockies we have the Chinook effect, which is a downslope foehn wind that warms and dries. So you'd have a dry belt, and probably one that didn't form an ice sheet, along the east slopes of the Rockies from the Yukon down through Alberta, Montana. In that area it's called the ice-free corridor because of the Chinook effect. So animals can spread from lowlands of Alaska through the Northwest Territory and down that ice-free corridor into the United States and South America and Central America. And we had huge amounts of animals during the Ice Age living in these areas. And this is how they would spread. And man would also spread through this corridor early in the Ice Age, but late in the Ice Age, as the ice sheets got thicker and the oceans cooled off, it would fill in. Because we know it filled in because we have Ice Age debris in Alberta in those areas. We also have a lot of fossils underneath the Ice Age debris of some of those animals like mastodons and mammoths. These are some of those that passed through the corridor that lived there for a while and got trapped during the Ice Age and are under the Ice Age debris. You had a similar situation for animals spreading to Australia. In Southeast Asia, it'd be warm even during the Ice Age. So the sea level drops, it's a huge shallow areas, and so they can make it pretty close to Australia. There'd be a few deep areas, and some can swim, or maybe man took some to Australia, but this is how I believe it can spread to Australia, which is kind of a mystery of why you get all these marsupials there. Either man brought them or they quickly spread after the flood over shallow areas of Southeast Asia.
The distribution of wildlife poses some puzzles for modern biologists. Why do we find giant land tortoises on islands in the Pacific Ocean and 10,000 miles away in the Indian Ocean, but nowhere in between? Why do we find identical plants on either side of the Atlantic Ocean? These kinds of disjunct or split ranges can't be explained by the way organisms travel and live in the present. The worldwide flood described in the Bible and its effects on the earth may offer essential clues to explain these split ranges. Of course, many fish were able to survive outside the ark. Even freshwater animals could survive. Many people don't realize that fresh water from rivers like the Amazon can float for years above the ocean without mixing. So freshwater animals could survive the flood in fresh water, floating above the salty ocean water. Many plants that weren't on the ark could have floated during the flood, some even in the floating freshwater. As the floodwaters receded, plants and fish would have been left behind at lakes and other places around the world. Many plants would have continued to float. providing a way to distribute animals after the flood. After Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, hundreds of thousands of Douglas fir trees were ripped up and remained floating on the lake 25 years later. If Noah's flood ripped up every forest in the world, mats of trees probably stayed afloat for centuries. As winds blew these enormous log mats in circular paths in the oceans, they would have served as rafts for animals to cross oceans. Rafts may also explain how tortoises got to remote islands. Interestingly, most modern animals and plants with ranges split across oceans follow the pattern of modern currents. Their distribution can be explained by rafting. In this way, the flood and its aftermath provide a solution for one of the many mysteries of biology: split ranges.
Those things that you probably never even thought about that you'd have being taught in Sunday school class, of all places. All right, let's. We got some questions at the end, but it's going to be. Well, go ahead. We can go through them, Richard. Why don't you put them up there for us? Some of them you may not be able to answer very well because they are kind of. I don't know. We may not be familiar with some of the questions that are being asked here, but it says. How might the Ice Age be a part of the discussions about the truth of the gospel? If you were to have a talk with somebody who's bringing up the Ice Age, could you transition into the gospel with that? Could you talk about how it actually started? Noah's flood, and then you go to Noah's flood and you say, hey, there's something else that God has provided to save people from His wrath to come. What is that? Jesus Christ is the New Testament ark of salvation, right? So you can jump right into a gospel presentation that way. Did you have something, Bill, did you say?
I could do it better today than I could yesterday.
Could do it better today than you did yesterday. All right, number 2. Is it important for each of you to know the details of the inner workings of the latest Ice Age models as you seek to share the gospel with others? How many people think you need? How many people do you think you know that know those? So, is it really that important for you to know them intimately? Now, is it important that maybe you should be able to give some answers? The Bible says that we're to study to be able to give an answer to people, right? So, obviously, that would be okay to learn a few of those things. But are those things necessary to know how to give the gospel to somebody? No, not necessary. You could spend your time arguing a model or arguing a system of how something could have happened and never get to the gospel, and all you're doing is arguing about a useless fact at that point. Now, if you know that and can use it to transition in the gospel, that's what you should. That's what this whole lesson's about anyways. So it's not that you fill your head with a bunch of knowledge about things, but so that you could have an answer to be able to give somebody. Okay? Number 3. How could you respond to someone who asks you a question about the Ice Age or any other topic that you are unable to answer? Lie to them and tell them and pretend that you know the answer? What's the best way to respond? Look it up and get back to them. Yeah, and that's the best way to talk to anybody about anything. I mean, if you lie to people and they find out you're lying, they don't want to listen to anything else you had to say. Right? I mean, that's just how human beings are. I don't like it when people lie to me. I'd just much rather not be around you anymore if you're going to keep lying to me every time you talk to me. So that's the idea. All right, number 4. Many people are afraid of the effects of global warming. How does Genesis 8:20 to 22 give you assurance of the future? Are you worried about global warming? I'm sure there's not too many in our room that are. In fact, I'm pretty sure nobody, I would hope, is. Yes, Darla.
It says he's not ever going to flood the earth again.
He's not going to curse, he's not going to flood. Yeah, and the seasons are going to remain. Yep. Will they have their variations in them? Will there be sometimes you'll have a dry summer and a hot summer? Yeah. Will there be times Obviously, the Ice Age was an experience that was different that we won't probably have ever again, or not anything of the like, anything close to that. We're not going to talk. We didn't talk about it. I thought one of the videos covered it, but they did talk about there being a small ice age at one point back in the 1600s, but it was rare. And the reason why it was small, it wasn't that they had ice building up all over the place, was because they had very mild summers. It had to do with what was going on with the sun. That the sun didn't have its heat. They call it the sunspots. They had very few. They had 40 within a period of like 80 years, as opposed to 40,000. And they don't really know exactly what caused that, but that actually affected the temperature. And it didn't allow things to melt off as fast and kept things cold longer. So, all right, let's see. Next one. Which one are we on? I don't even remember the number. Well, I'll just read the question here. How does understanding that God is faithful give you assurance as His child? If He's faithful to keep the seasons and faithful to do what He said, how does that give you assurance as His child? Okay, that's one. You know He's not going to flood the earth. But as His child, has He made promises to us?
Yeah, salvation's a guarantee.
That salvation's a guarantee. You can't lose that once you got it. That He'll never leave you or forsake you. That He's coming back for you. Right? Those are things that you can look to as He keeps His word. Huh?
That's my kids' places and I go back and get them because they're mine.
Yeah. God doesn't leave His children behind. Yeah. All right. Next one. Are you aware of any models from biblical creationists that have changed over time? Does this mean the Bible is not true? I would imagine nobody is. Anybody know any other models than the one you just heard today about the earth getting hot, or the waters getting hot and the aerosols covering and keeping keeping things from melting off too quick? Okay, so that's probably not significant, but when people change their models, does that necessarily mean the Bible's untrue? No. Do people change their models to try to account for what the Scriptures say? Sometimes. And I'm not talking about millions of years people. I'm talking about creationists. If you go and study the creationism, let me give you one example that is something that has floated around for a while among the creationists. In Genesis chapter 1, the third day of creation, when it talks about the firmament being in the heavens, and they talked about there being a canopy that sits over. But that's been, for a lot of people, they've had issues with that because it's caused other things that are unscientific or that would have destroyed life. They've talked about how could you see the stars, how could you see the sun, the moon. And so there's been arguments that have gone on both sides. Are they either one right or wrong? I don't know. I wasn't there. Were you? No. But does that mean the Bible's wrong because we don't understand it and don't know how to necessarily give a right model to explain it? No. It just means that we don't know, right? We don't have all the knowledge, and God doesn't necessarily give us every last little detail to explain things. So, okay, so we're left with that. Okay, is there one more there? How can you use God's creation to offer Him praise for His attributes? Was that on there, Richard? Last one. If not, we can argue it here. How can you use God's creation to offer Him praise for His attributes? Yep, there it is. How can you use God's creation to offer Him praise for His attributes? Any thoughts? That He's always faithful. Okay. What else? What else do we learn from His creation? His knowledge to keep things running right and working together. What about His power? Is His power on display in the creation? The Bible says that's what we learn from the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. So we know that He's obviously got infinite power to do what He does, to take care of it. So it causes us to want to thank Him for who He is, right? And help us to trust Him in the midst of those things. All right, well, let's go ahead and close in prayer, and then we're going to come back in about 15 minutes. About 11:15 will be our time. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your love for us. We do pray that you will help us, even though this was not necessarily a scripture verse by verse lesson, it does help us have answers to be able to explain things that are in our world. And so I pray that you'll be glorified in all that we do. I pray you'll help us to be people that want to give answers to people and point people ultimately to the gospel. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, you are dismissed.